We're very honored to be here, and we thank him for inviting us. And, okay, here we go. So we just wanted to give you a sense of what you're going to hear here today. And there's going to be a lot of information and a perspective that is unusual. And these films that are coming up this week will present various other perspectives. And our perspective comes from the evolutionary upward spiral of the consciousness of humanity and the role that the Mayflower Pilgrims, our ancestors, and the Native Americans have played in that and will play in that as we all go forward into the future. We carry forth the vision that our ancestors brought here, that the framers of the Constitution brought forth for America. And we feel that until we bring the Native American into the conversation, we bring them to the table as equals, beyond the victim-perpetrator model, into the eagle-eye view of the evolution of humanity, this nation cannot realize its true potential, that we're missing an important foundational piece of our national psyche until we bring in the Native American. So we are going to give you a perspective that will lay a foundation for us to go forward.
So it's a real honor for me as an Englishman to be here. I'm not a Mayflower descendant, but I did arrive on these shores on Thanksgiving Day of 1969, which is 46 years ago. And it's been quite an adventure and continues. And one of the most interesting things I have encountered so far in my American sojourn has been Connie Baxter Marlow here being a Mayflower descendant and getting me involved in all this extraordinary stuff. I'd never heard of Squanto, I'd never heard of Massasoit, I'd never heard of Bradford, and on. And now I'm writing novels and making films on the subject, and it's very interesting. It's wildly dramatic. It's almost highly unlikely that you folks are sitting here in this room. How could it be? Is there such a thing as God's providence, perhaps? Otherwise, I don't think anyone would be here. It's interesting. This just went, why did the screen go okay? Oh, it wants me to join cable Wi-Fi. This is exciting. Excuse me. You can talk, honey. Why it's doing that. So it's going to be a quick sweep of the history, starting back in 1606 with the Scrooby Covenant. We'll very quickly review the adventure that resulted in the Mayflower landing at the end of 1620 at Cape Cod. Then we'll go very quickly into the Native American side of the story. What was going on before the Mayflower? Who was here? Why did the Mayflower land and find an essentially empty place? How could that be? Very interesting. I think I can say that we are about to make an announcement. You are the very first people to hear it, people, period. I've kept it very close to the chest. This is a historical discovery that attending, for example, the NEH History Conference at Plymouth Plantation last October, and listened very carefully to those 20 leading historians to see if they saw what I saw, and the answer was no, they didn't. It's to do with the disease, the pandemic, whatever it was that took such a high proportion of the native people out 4 years roughly before the Mayflower arrived. And then all the misbeliefs, the misunderstandings, the current situation. So we're going to look at that. Then we're going to go into an idea, the challenges that we face to really, it's as much as anything for me about healing that split between the red people and the white people and that history that's become so painful. And then proposals for resolution, and then coming from a completely different, higher place that sees us moving forward into the future, giving honor to both the Pilgrims and the Indians. And I'd like to start with the Scrooby Covenant.
How many of you are familiar with the Scrooby Covenant in 1606?
This is how it all started, folks.
the Treasonous Act.
An illegal gathering in England in 1606 at Cambridge University that resulted in this statement that resulted in the phenomenon known as the Mayflower Pilgrims. Would you like to read it, Connie?
As ye Lord's free people joined themselves by a covenant of the Lord into a church estate, in ye fellowship of ye gospel, to walk in all his ways, made known or to be made known to them according to their best endeavor, whatever it should cost them, the Lord assisting them.
So it's a wait a minute. It's a very long and complex story, and I imagine that most of you in this room know most of the facts, so you'll realize that we are skipping. We're just going to sort of the salient points, such as this picture, which represents the departure from Europe, from Holland, where the folks who had spent their 12 years in Leiden got on the Speedwell, went to England famously to join the Mayflower. And as we all know, the Speedwell didn't speed very well. And so everybody ended up on the Mayflower, and some people actually remained behind. So here's the Mayflower traveling across the ocean on one of its better days, because the 66 days were intense. They were rough. I'm a sailor. I have sailed. I know what it's like to be out there in hurricane season. I really do. It's a relative miracle that I'm standing here today, because certain old wooden boats held up amazingly well, and if they didn't, I would have become fish food, you know? And then landfall. After that 66 days, actually to sight land. An extraordinary feeling, obviously, of joy, I would imagine mixed with terror. What are we about to do? What are we thinking? Are we crazy? Before landing, Connie?
Signing of the Compact, which we're celebrating here today. And this is the first document of democracy in the Western world. And it's important to note that it brought those principles of equal and just laws serving the common good, and that they were forming themselves into a civil body politic and electing governors and offices and officers to serve the governed. And as you all know, you have the compact here, but we have a couple of the salient points here, which you've just read the covenant, so the compact,
right.
So we can
do a couple of quick little bits. Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith and honor of our king and country a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, Massachusetts, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic, to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. Having enacted the compact, there was an agreement as to how they would behave once they arrived on land. Here's a picture, somewhat fantastical. What's wrong with this picture? Can anybody point out something that's sort of unlikely? Anyone? Can you all see the screen, by the way? And if whoever cable wire fires would kindly desist. Sorry about that. Firstly, they're beautifully, beautifully dressed. Would they have come ashore in their finest costumes? Secondly, if you look over on that side against the tree, there's a beautiful Native American person standing there. There were no Native American people standing there. They didn't meet the first Native American until the spring equinox of 1621, roughly 4 months later. Very important point. It probably, let's see if this works, yes. It probably looks a lot more like this. It was probably a little rougher, a little raggeder, and again, this picture has something wrong with it, if you will. Women. It's highly unlikely that the ladies would have been the first ashore. But, you know, this is probably a little closer to reality. Now, on shore, observing this with a certain amount of alarm is this gentleman. Whoa, what's going on? They were not unfamiliar with Europeans. They were not unfamiliar with fishermen from many countries, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. So these gentlemen are remarkably different looking from your average Mayflower Pilgrim, aren't they? They were different in so many respects that it's extraordinary that when they did meet, they actually made friends and actually lived together for more than half a century. Do you know that that's a fact that is lost in today's America? Most people seem to believe that the Mayflower came ashore as an invading army or brought smallpox blankets and wild stories that I'm certain that you people don't believe in any sense. But Americans in general, we're discovering that at least 3 out of 4 Americans have the most extraordinary misbeliefs. And part of this talk will be about those misbeliefs. And another part will be about, well, what do we do about that? How do you change this country's beautiful origin story, this gem of half a century of intercultural friendship that then turned into a disaster owing to King Philip's War, and I think we all know that. So, a little history. What was going on at the time? The French were up to the north. You had New France, you had the English settlers coming in, and this is not a very accurate map, but it just gives an idea of the areas that are today the maritime provinces of eastern Canada, Nova Scotia. Very important place for this story we're about to tell you, because we're actually about to reveal something that I don't think anybody really knows. It has to do with native people from Nova Scotia. Just make a note of that. How many tribes were there at the time? Can you count? There were dozens or hundreds of different groups, speaking different languages, having different cultural mores and social structures. Some of these names, if you could read them, would be familiar. Many, they simply don't exist anymore. They've passed, they've been assimilated, they've died off. We don't know.
We're sorry that the screen is so small that you can't really see much, but...
Yeah, in fact, that's a real apology. The screen is provided by the facility here, and we were sort of appalled to see such a tiny screen. Around about 1936, this will be more familiar. There's Cape Cod, clearly. There are the Wampanoags. There are the Penacooks and the various tribes to the north, the Nipmucs, the Mohegans, the Mohawks inland. That was pretty much the situation round about 1620. It had changed radically in the years immediately prior to the landing of the Mayflower, which is why the Mayflower landed and there was nobody there. There was a major change, which we'll talk about. If you look at those tribes, you will see on land, you'll see the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, my goodness, I can barely read them, the Wawanok. But what I'd like you to notice is and I think I can point this out. Yeah, here we are. Do you see those guys? The Mi'kmaq. What are they doing out in the ocean? Don't Indians live on land? Whoa, that's you. Yeah, careful. Most people think the Native Americans lived on land. There was one tribe that was a seafaring tribe. They lived on the island known as Nova Scotia today. I don't know what they called it. They today are called the Mi'kmaq. There was a time they have been known, you'll find them in Bradford, and they are called the Tarratines, ye Tarratines. And they were very, very fierce, powerful warriors, and they had a technology that gave them an immense advantage over the other tribes. Now remember, this is before the coming of the Mayflower. So what was going on during those years before the Mayflower? Firstly, we had villages on land. This might be a typical native village. We've learned subsequently that they had cycles and they planted their corn close to the ocean and then harvested their crop and moved inland for the winters and so on. But this was not known to the Pilgrims at the time or to John Smith when he came in 1614. How did they get around? One way was, anybody here been to Plymouth Plantation and seen down at the Wampanoag village, they're making these great big dugout canoes out of single tree trunks, right? That mode of transport is called the Mishoon, and we call it a dugout canoe. Is it a high-speed mode of transport? No, it's sluggish. Can you get lots of people in them? Well, if you make really large ones, and there were huge ones, you can. But generally speaking, they were pretty darn slow. What did the guys up north have? Different technology. They had the Birch-Bark Canoe. They did not have Mishoons. They did not have big trees up there, I don't believe. And they had developed this very high-speed technology because they were a raider culture. By a raider culture, I mean that they didn't raise their own crops. The people to the south raised the crops, and this time of year, down would come these canoes with these fierce warriors and return with a fine winter's load of corn and beans and squash and fair young maidens. Okay? That was the life they had developed in order to survive up in Nova Scotia. So you might have had a scene like this. Trading happening with these large boats that could transport large numbers of people. Okay? This is important to our story because this is what was going on before the coming of the Mayflower. And you could have this, a scene like this, with literally an armada of canoes. And if you look at this picture, it has a couple of alarming things. It has an awful lot of fierce-looking warriors, and a number of them, I don't know what to do about that, so I'll just keep blipping it out. A number of them are apparently firing muskets. Muskets, excuse me? Well, the Micmac, or the Tarratines, were the first to befriend the French. And the French armed them with muskets, which gave them an enormous advantage. Aside from their high-speed transportation, they now had guns. This changed the balance of power in northern New England. Why is this important? Well, something happened. Can anybody tell me what happened to the native people at Patuxet, for example, which is today called Plymouth? When the Mayflower came ashore, who was living there right at that place? Anybody? Nobody. Why not? Disease. They had apparently all perished in some sort of epidemic, pandemic, horrific disease, the likes of which the Indian people had never experienced before. So I'm going to show you what I think happened, because there are all sorts of theories. Oh, the English brought smallpox. They brought it intentionally with smallpox blankets. Captain Hunt's crew had smallpox. The French, there were 2 shiploads of French sailors who had come before the Mayflower, who the Indians captured and killed. Maybe they brought smallpox. Interesting fact, it was not smallpox. So therefore, smallpox blankets have nothing to do with it. Smallpox has nothing to do with it. The smallpox idea has been abandoned. There are a number of other diseases. I personally believe, for a long time believed it to be the plague, bubonic plague. But I could not see how rats and fleas, I think we all know that the plague is transmitted through, its vector is rats and fleas. Too slow. Couldn't have done this damage that fast. But last year in London, an archaeological excavation revealed that there's another form of plague that occurs with a malnourished population. Was the population of New England malnourished in those years between, let's go to the slide, 1607 to 1619, there's a phenomenon called the Tarratines War Does anyone here know about the Tarratines War? Anybody? Yeah, this is interesting. I have asked very serious historians, tell me what you know about the Tarratines War. The answer is always, the what? Connie's cousin up in Maine is a very serious historian in these affairs. The what? I say, was sitting by his computer. I said, Google it. Up comes tons of information, so you can go and inform yourselves. There was a war going on that's completely forgotten that was absolutely brutal. It's too long a story to go into as what the war, why it occurred, how it ended, but it started around 1607, ended in 1619. The Massachusetts people, there was a large Massachusetts federation. Who knows that? Led by a man named Nanepashemet. Who knows that? Nanepashemet went up north to help his allies and got into big trouble, and the Tarratines came down with a serious, devastating effect on the coastal tribes. So during the Tarratines War, between 1607 and 1619, seafaring warriors from Nova Scotia decimated the coastal tribes from Maine to Cape Cod. This is historical fact. In the process, my theory is the warriors unwittingly spread a deadly disease. Between the years of 1616 and 1618, an epidemic of plague from French fur traders came down from the north with the warriors. Imagine this war, this hand-to-hand combat, this bloodthirsty activity, and the warriors are carrying this disease. They're also sickening and dying. Most of those warriors ended up dying of the same disease. And by 1620, when the Mayflower landed, the native population had been severely reduced, making English colonization possible. Okay, so that's quite honestly a revelation. You are the first people to hear that. I think we're going to discover that this is as good a theory as there is. I've heard many others and they don't stand up, and I haven't yet found the hole in this one, if there is a hole in this one. So Connie.
So we have the visionary, what we consider the visionary Mayflower Pilgrims arriving in Plymouth and meeting a visionary Native American leader named Massasoit. And what ensued was an exception to the human condition then and now, because these people, these leaders, kept their people in peace and friendship for this 54-year period. And our thesis is that it was a synthesis that gave birth to the American mind and the American spirit, that by the time 1776 came around, there was an American mind. It was completely different from the European mind. And this was said to me by a man who was head of the State House in Boston. I didn't coach him, I was interviewing him. He's a Minuteman in Lexington on the 4th of July, and I just was interviewing him, and he said this, that the American mind was different because of the interaction with the Native Americans. So this is a key aspect of our understanding of this melding of cultures that occurred in New England at that time. At this point in our psyche, we have conflated, confused, collapsed what happened in New England with what happened in South America, with Columbus. You know, as soon as you mention the Mayflower Pilgrim, you get Columbus. You know, what happened in South America. It's a very different situation, not just amongst the Mayflower Pilgrims, but the Puritans as well. How much that the effort to live in friendship and in trading and working together, so that so we've got the Samoset, the photo of Samoset welcoming the English in Plymouth. And we've got meeting Massasoit. that they came and met with Massasoit, created a peace treaty that lasted 50 years. And this treaty, here are the salient points of the treaty, that neither he nor any of his should do hurt to any of their people, meaning the Pilgrims. That if any of his did hurt any of theirs, he should send the offender, that they might punish him. That if anything were taken away from any of theirs, he should cause it to be restored, and they should do the like to his. If any did unjustly war against him, they would aid him. If any did war against them, he should aid them. He should send his neighbors, confederates, send to his neighbors, confederates, to certify them of this, that they might not wrong them, but might likewise be compromised in the conditions of peace. That when their men came to them, they should leave their bows and arrows behind them. That King James would esteem Massasoit and his friend as his friend and ally. So this is extraordinary. Not only the fact that it was created on the first meeting of Massasoit and Governor Carver at the time, but that it was upheld for 54 years through thick and thin. And so during this time, the first Thanksgiving occurred, which we all know about is a somewhat controversial in the Indian world, and now in the American mind and spirit. Was this in fact a time of feasting and celebration of equals, of people who were in peace, or was it you hear all sorts of stories, but it's to us, it's a magnificent, inspiring symbol of what we can be if we come together in our hearts to move forward into what the vision of what the native people had been living with, a participatory democracy, and what the Pilgrims had drafted in the Mayflower Compact with the democratic principles that were in the compact. So
there are several different. Are we still up, John? Are we still up on this? There are several different visions of what this meal looked like. The one up there is a very well-known image. Here's another one. It was actually an immigration meeting, and it says there, "Chief signing executive order letting you stay in country." Don't think so, but it probably looks a bit more like this, which was a very prayerful gathering with the native people involved, but sort of over there, and a certain amount of fear, I would imagine, to begin with, but gradually it lasted for 3 days. They exercised their arms, which means they fired off their muskets. The Indians did all sorts of things. They ended up playing games and having a whole lot of fun, it sounds like, if you read the account. There's a version that looks like this, which is it just doesn't seem to me that that's what it looked like at all. So now we're going to get into the relationship. So we've seen the Mayflower coming across the Atlantic. We've seen who they met. We've learned a little bit about the Native Americans, and I think a little bit about what was going on, what had preceded the landing of the Mayflower. When I started getting into this research, and I'm writing a book and a screenplay for a major motion picture, and I realized that in order to really have some authority, I would have to know what had happened before the Mayflower landed. And you cannot go to Plymouth, Massachusetts and learn that, because those people, as we well know, are gone. There are no survivors of the Patuxet people who could go and say, "Tell me what happened." Everyone there, every native person there is from somewhere else. And you just don't get the story straight without widening the scope of your investigation several hundred miles. You need to go way inland and find yourself in Haudenosaunee or Iroquois territory. You need to go way north and find yourself in Penobscot and Micmac territory. you need to go way back in time. You need to go back to the beginning. So what I did is I went as far back as I could. What was the very first encounter between European and Native American? And so you have Cartier and Champlain and the whole, all the way up to John Smith in 1614, painting a very highly populated picture of Massachusetts Bay, and then only 6 years later the Mayflower arriving to find the place deserted. Very interesting. So now we're in relationship. We now have the Pilgrims and the Indians, the Pokanoket Indians of Massasoit, in relationship. And Massasoit, at some point, they got word that Massasoit was dying. He was sick and he was dying, and they sent Winslow to say farewell to their friend. This was a big, big deal, Connie.
And it's important to understand that the Pilgrims, it's often thought that the Pilgrims they didn't know anything, they were stupid, they didn't know how to survive. And what people don't understand is that they actually saved the life of Massasoit. I don't know how many of you are aware of that fact.
Is everyone in this room aware of the fact that the Pilgrims saved Massasoit's life? Yep, okay. That's a major fact, and that probably saved the Pilgrims, because had Massasoit died, things would have changed. And had Massasoit not realized the degree to which the English were indeed his friends, he would not necessarily have failed to join a conspiracy that was brewing at that precise moment. There was actually a plan among the various tribes to come in and eliminate the white invaders, not merely the Plymouth people, but the Wessagusset people, who were another colony had started, and they were misbehaving and mistreating the Indians. It was not good, and it was going to result in the death of everyone, quite honestly.
But I'll just read this. This is from Good News from New England. Then I called Hobamok and desired him to tell Massasoit that the governor, hearing of his sickness, was sorry for the same. And though by reason of many businesses he could not come himself, yet he sent me with such things for him as he thought most likely to do him good in this his extremity. So this is written by Edward Winslow. And whereof, if he pleased to take, I would presently give him, which he desired, and having a confection of many comfortable conserves, etc., on the point of my knife, I gave him some, which I could scarce get through his teeth. When it was dissolved in his mouth, he swallowed the juice of it, whereat those that were about him much rejoiced, saying he had not swallowed anything in 2 days. Well, Massasoit miraculously recovered within hours and had been sick and dying for days, hadn't passed the stool, hadn't swallowed, was very ill. So this is what we're bringing to the table for the general public is information that totally deconstructs the misinformation and the myth around the Pilgrims and Indians.
Now, what was going on at precisely this time is something that we could call the Wessagusset Affair. This other colony was at a place, the Indian name of which was Wessagusset. Today it's called Weymouth, Massachusetts. And after Massasoit was healed and saved by Winslow, he issued a warning. I'm just going to give you the quick points here. He gave a warning through Hobamok. Hobamok was a native friend of the Pilgrims who became their guide. It was Squanto or Tisquantum and Hobamok and one other who became the Indian men who really helped the Pilgrims. Massasoit issued a warning. He then gave instructions to do something horrific that the Pilgrims would never had done. However, if you didn't, you were dead. What do you do? So, under the guidance of Hobamok, some events unfolded. Miles Standish killed 6 or 8 sachems, Indian chiefs, under the instruction of Massasoit, in the presence of Hobamok, who took Standish and 8 men and said, that man, that one, that one, that one, take them out. And it's a wildly dramatic story. They actually did it with the Indians' own knives in hand-to-hand combat. These little, standish, Captain Shrimp they called him, and these great big 6'4" Indians. How did they do that? I don't know. And what's really interesting, and it emerged from this conference at Plymouth Plantation last year, that this consolidated Massasoit's power base. The natives who were conspiring against the Pilgrims were also Massasoit's enemies. And by getting rid of them, the effect was that he became the most powerful Native American in New England, the wealthiest, the most powerful. It's an interesting, without that, the history could not have been what it was. So the Wessagusset Affair starts out with Massasoit recovering from his near-death experience and saying, "Now I see the English are my friends and love me, and whilst I live, I will never forget this kindness they have shown me." That, I believe, was a major turning point. Without that event, I don't see how your ancestors could have survived. And then, as they were leaving, Winslow writes, "At our coming away, he called Hobamok to him, and privately, none hearing save 2 or 3 of his pinnaces who are of his council, revealed the plot of the Massachusetts, before spoken of, against Master Weston's colony, and so against us, saying that the people of Nauset, Pamet, Succonet, Matachiest, Manamet, Agawam, and the Isle of Capawack, which is Martha's Vineyard, were joined with them." So all of those tribes, and they were recruiting others, and they wanted Massasoit to join this plot to basically kill off Weston's people, and then inevitably they would have to take out Plymouth, and they could very, very easily have done that. Therefore, as we respected the lives of our countrymen and our own after safety, in other words, our own safety afterwards, he advised us to kill the men of Massachusetts, who were the authors of this intended mischief. That was the first huge challenge they faced. They called a council meeting. They said, "No, we don't do this. We negotiate. We talk. There's no way we're going to kill people. If you don't, you're dead. You're gone." Dilemma, what do? You'll see that one of these, I think it's the Rick Burns, is it a Rick Burns? Pilgrim film very much focuses on that and very much demonizes Standish. So I think it's worth asking the question, what would anyone have done under those circumstances? You were presented with 2 choices: die and all your loved ones with you, or get violent, which they did amazingly effectively. And they had help. They were guided by Hobamok. So this is a picture of them marching to Wessagusset to deal with this situation. Or actually they sailed, you can see the boat out there, they came ashore and they went in, but they left their guns behind. They really tricked, they used the Indians were very, very cunning in their approach, and they used the Indians' own ways to do that.
You see, the evolution of the American mind.
So the situation was for that, so here we are, 1621, the freedom and friendship that lasted from 1621 to 1675, during which very normal things like trading, interactions. Part of the book I'm writing has to do with actually a woman, actually Priscilla Mullins, befriending a native woman and becoming lifelong friends, raising their kids together and exchanging recipes and becoming friends. And then, after many examples of such friendship, King Philip's War, which was about 15 years, I believe, in the making, during which, firstly, Philip's older brother, Wamsuta, known as Alexander, sold land, accumulated money, purchased the latest in European weaponry. They had flintlock guns. The Pilgrims didn't have anything like that. They had medieval equipment. They had old matchlock weapons, and they were farmers. They were not soldiers. So the Indians became and this is it's pretty well laid out in Philbrick's book, Mayflower, the amount of preparation that went into what became Philip's War. And the calling in of Wamsuta and the calling in of Philip and saying, "We hear you're planning war. We hear you're accumulating weapons." "Oh, no, we're not." "Well, you need to bring your weapons and hand them in. We need peace." They tried very hard to come up with a diplomatic solution to this dilemma. The Indians were getting more and more riled up. Of course, 22,000 odd English had arrived in Massasoit Bay Colony. The whole situation had turned around. And, well, finally it broke down. And violence replaced diplomacy. It became the bloodiest per capita war, conflict on American soil since the landing of the Mayflower that we know of. So here are a few violent, scary scenes. And as Connie will say,
it was a tragedy, really. It was a civil war between families who had known each other for this 50 years, a second generation of people who had lived together in peace. And so it's not just a we-they situation. It's any civil war becomes a tragedy because it's families against families, it's friends against friends. It's as I said, not a we-they black and white situation. So,
and you don't know who you can trust, because all of a sudden every Indian is a potential enemy, and someone who was a definite friend and you've known him since you were 2 years old together are pulling off really, really terrifying things. So, disaster called King Philip's War. And we're just going to jump now, because after what happened with King Philip's War, of course, is I hear numbers anywhere from 800 to 2,500 English died. More Indians died than that. Ultimately, the natives lost. It was touch and go. The Mohawk actually came on the side of the English. Had they come on the side of Philip, who knows what would have happened.
But after that war, the Indian basically disappeared from history. They were sold as slaves off into the West Indies, and they disappeared. So all we have in the historical telling of the story is Squanto and the Pilgrims and Thanksgiving. So the story has been out of balance from the beginning, because in the beginning it was just these amazing pilgrims doing this amazing stuff, and here's Squanto, and here's the Thanksgiving dinner, and off we go into the great white American dream. Okay, so what has happened is that the pendulum has swung the other side now, and is demonizing the Pilgrims in order to make the Indian look better and bring the Indian to the stage in a powerful position of victim, and the guilt of the white man and the anger and victimization of the Indian has what we believe this country paralyzed in a moral dilemma of guilt and blame and shame. I mean, how can a country go forward and become this great light to humanity when we have our origin story locked in blame and shame and guilt? So that's what we're attempting to do with this work.
And then, if you see the fifth point down there, the 1960s. The hippies.
Who's a hippie in this room? Any hippies in this room?
People discovering native wisdom worldwide. What happened in the 1960s? Indian gurus started coming over from the East. The Beatles showed up. And white American kids ended up going to Indian reservations and getting into sweat lodges and peyote ceremonies and sitting with native elders. And what I believe was happening was that we, the people, the white people, were for the first time really going, wait a minute, these people, the indigenous peoples of the world, have something really important that we have ignored. They were ignored firstly because they didn't appear to have religion, or they didn't have a recognizable religion to the very Christian people who settled the country. Slowly we realized that what they have to offer is precious. And this is a really important part of our work. Our work is not Indian bashing. It's restoring the balance, or creating a balance that's never been there. It's about honor for both the Pilgrims and the Indians. The native peoples of the world are precious to all of humanity.
And have something to bring to the party. Even in the 1500s, there's always been our dream of utopia, our dream of of what the American Constitution promises and the Declaration of Independence. You know, liberty, justice, abundance for all, the great American dream, we can all have it, right? Well, that was, even in the 1500s when Sir Thomas More wrote the book Utopia, that came from reports from the Americas of Indians, native peoples living without property, in total sharing, and reverence for life. And what I've spent 30 years with Native Americans, and what I discovered from being with them is that reverence for life, is that whole baseline of cosmology that is missing in our Western mind and thinking. So that's why we're speaking that there is a future yet to come to pass from bringing our understandings together and going forward together, that there's something missing. There's something that the Western heart and mind has always yearned for, but has never achieved. And in fact, the native people hadn't achieved it either, because they were doing the same things to each other, even though they had this cosmology and this connection. And also the West, we have Jesus Christ himself, you know, who walked this miraculous life and shared these miraculous teachings that we all aspire to. But what did Christianity do with his teachings? So this dichotomy in the human psyche of what we dream we can be as opposed to what we are. And I think that's what's on the table right now. If you look at the world situation, it's a human problem. It's a human challenge. Okay, how are we going to get beyond what's on the stage today? And you know, there's no way of saying, oh, it's this problem or that problem, this race, that country, this, that, the other thing. It's about humanity, looking at the evolution of humanity. Where are we going to go from here? So,
all right. So the 1960s, this discovery that the natives had something precious. Around about the same time, something else began, which was the natives themselves began to become activists, began to rise up, began to demand their rights, began to protest at their treatment. And it's absolutely true that the native people of this country have suffered enormously as a result of the arrival and the takeover by Europeans. Nobody can contest that. So in the 1970s, we have the emergence of AIM, the American Indian Movement, which I sort of jokingly call the Angry Indian Movement. It was a very angry, protest-oriented movement that ended up with some real violence. FBI agents were killed. One of the native leaders, Leonard Peltier, is still sitting in prison to this day, and it was a very tough time indeed. And in Plymouth, Massachusetts, we actually had Frank James. You aware of the native man Frank James?
Of Frank James.
Also known as, he took the native name Wamsuta, which was King Philip's older brother. And he was asked to present a talk at a Plymouth Thanksgiving Day, and the talk was actually suppressed. It was regarded as too radical. And so he started a movement in Plymouth, which resulted in lots of Indians coming in, getting vocally, verbally abusive to white people in Plymouth on Thanksgiving Day. They've renamed Thanksgiving the National Day of Mourning. And Thanksgiving has now become a symbol for everything bad that's ever happened to the native people of all of the Americas throughout history.
And I call it a case of mistaken identity, because the Mayflower Pilgrims were the most like them, what they desired. What you read in that covenant is the essence of the native way. The Lord's free people, they don't use the Lord. The Creator's free people. If you just switch out providence and Creator, you know, from this providence-based paradigm that the Pilgrims, that the founders of this country had. You know, the native people have a creator-based paradigm, a trust-based paradigm. On our coins is "In God We Trust." Okay, so that creator-based similarity between us all.
So I'm going to accelerate a little here because we only have about another 15 minutes. You see the last term there, revisionist history. What began sometime in the 1960s, it may have become much earlier. We're finding evidence of this actually back into the 1920s, the 19-teens. Revisionist history. People stepping up and saying, no, 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 it wasn't the way you heard it. No, they didn't meet. No, they weren't friends. And all sorts of crazy misbeliefs were propagated. So we'll get into that very quickly.
Howard Zinn wrote a book called The People's History of America. And
Wonderful book.
Be ashamed of himself.
Well, wonderful, wonderful book, taking the viewpoint and the side of the underdog. But I don't think he did his homework. Certainly in regard to the Pilgrims, which I know something about, he talked to the wrong people is what he did. Because if he spoke to the wrong people, you got this misinformation that I personally believe to be misinformation. So you had revisionist history resulting in this phenomenon called the National Day of Mourning, which started in 1970, continues to this day. We will be there at the National Day of Mourning on Thursday in Plymouth because we show up. We're friends of the Indians. We love the Indians. We've gradually been developing trust by decades of just showing up and staying quiet and being there and them knowing that you come back.
And I hand out We Are Family buttons.
Connie made these buttons with a turtle on and uses Indians walking around with this We Are Family. Now, now we're going to get into the challenges we face to resolve. There's a situation. I think we've expressed the situation. Here's one of the challenges, is this belief system, this system of these, and I just selected 10 common misbeliefs. I'm going to go through them very quickly.
Because we have a handout here with
yeah.
misbeliefs and the fiction and the fact.
Yeah, please make sure you pick up a copy of the 10 common.
We're running out of time. Maybe we should just totally skip this.
So,
do your own.
Misbelief number 1. The Pilgrims gave the Indians smallpox-infected blankets, wiping out 90% of the indigenous people of New England. We have found that something like 3 out of 4 Americans actually believe that. It was a boggling discovery. And we now have artworks like this. Now, I don't know if you know it, but there is no evidence ever of smallpox blankets ever being used, and that technology ever working. It was certainly discussed hundreds of years after the Mayflower.
Keep moving past.
The Pilgrims were welcomed with open arms by the Indians. Well, the first encounter was an attack with a shower of arrows, so it wasn't the warmest welcome in the world. The Pilgrims would have died of starvation during the first winter if the Indians hadn't taken them in and fed them. Well, they didn't meet the Indians until the spring. Half of them died the first winter. They actually had plenty of food because everybody was sick and half of them were dead. They were not actually short of food at that point. And the Indians certainly did not take them in and shelter. You can read things, the Indians showed them how to build wigwams and fed them and nurtured them. Total fantasy. The Indians lived in universal peace and harmony before the coming of the Europeans. I've just told you about the Tarratines War. That's only one example of thousands of conflicts. Here's a picture from, I think it was Champlain. Here's an example, 2 warring tribes, and there's Champlain and his 2 muskets, which turned the balance of that particular conflict. Indian society was completely egalitarian. Everybody was equal. They didn't have kings and rulers and lords. Well, it's not exactly true. The Pokanoket royal family, Massasoit, was a royal person. 6, the Pilgrims came ashore. Now, this is crazy, but people do believe this. The Pilgrims came ashore as an invading army, raping and pillaging. They massacred the Indians they encountered, then sat down for a Thanksgiving feast with the survivors. I mean, that's about the nuttiest one, but people actually will tell you that. The Pilgrims and the Puritans were one and the same, and both were religious fanatics. And on that subject, we've been looking into this, what we regard as the spiritual alignment between the natives. It's actually, if you really look at the belief system and take away some of the terminology, as Connie just said, the Pilgrims were the most like the Indians of any of the subsequent people who came.
Here's some source material to what word am I looking for? Confirm that.
Okay.
Further, observing us to crave a blessing on our meat before we did eat, and after to give thanks for the same, He asked us what was the meaning of that ordinary custom. They were in the home of Corbitan, one of the Indian chiefs who didn't like pilgrims very much, but after they saved the life of Massasoit, he was thrilled to have them as his friends. I told them that whatsoever good things we had, we received from God, as the author and giver thereof, and therefore craved his blessing upon what we had, and were about to eat, that it might nourish and strengthen our bodies. And having eaten sufficient, being satisfied therewith, we again return thanks to the same our God for that our refreshing. All of them concluded to be very well, and said they believed almost all the same things, and that the same power that we called God, they called Khitan.
And that's from Edward Winslow's Good News from New England. Misbelief number 8. The Pilgrims were incompetent, ignorant convicts who were expelled from England. Once they landed, they had no idea how to fend for themselves. Well, here's one of those incompetent pilgrims. And here's what they built by 1624. They were not that incompetent. In fact, they were educated, they were farmers. The country they left in England was not that different from New England.
And as you all know, I'm sure, that Scrooby Covenant was a treasonous act. It was against the law to gather outside of the Church of England, and it was against the law not to attend the Church of England.
So that's where they were convicts, they were criminals. I guess that's where that comes from. Another great misbelief is that the Indians never harmed anyone. The Europeans came to North America and massacred the peace-loving inhabitants. Well, it went both ways. The Jamestown Massacre happened 1 year to the day after the Massasoit Treaty. And when the news of this reached New England, it's a miracle that everybody didn't get on boats and go back to England. But they stayed and they kept the faith and they kept their relationship with Massasoit and the Pokanokets. And finally, we all know that at the end of King Philip's War, Philip's head was taken and put on a pike and hung on the fort at Plymouth for decades. Why? His people had killed an awful lot of English people. And that's what happens. The first heads that were put on pikes were actually done by the Indians in June of 1675. So the fact is that when you have behavior like this, it has consequences. And if I were to do that, my head would probably end up on a pike. So, so the challenges we face are firstly these misbeliefs. Secondly, the total lack of information about the Tarratines War. Because if it could become widely known that the disease epidemic that took the Indians out was certainly not intentional by Europeans at all. It originated, I believe, with the French, but it was disseminated, it was spread through a native and intertribal conflict. So we're talking here about what we call the human shadow. The white man's shadow is very much on the table these days. We are feeling, is there anyone in this room who feels guilt about what the white man has done to the indigenous peoples of the world? Is there anybody who doesn't feel guilt? How could we not? Our behavior has been horrific. However, the other side, every time I go to a specific event, a massacre or something, and I look at what happened before, there's a film called The Dakota 38. Have you seen that? During Lincoln's time, where they hanged, the evil white people hanged 38 Lakota men. Did they do anything to deserve that? Well, they had just slaughtered 500 white people, men, women, and children. 300 warriors went in, and then the authorities or the army went in and grabbed 38 of the leaders and hanged them. The biggest mass hanging ever. But when you hear the story told, there's no mention of what they did. It's just always us doing horrific stuff to them. So it's about the balance. What's to be done? We could ignore it and it'll go away. No, it won't. I don't think so. So how do you, this is a profoundly, it's worldview, it's belief system that yes, horrific things happened, but also, yes, before the horrific things happened, there was half a century of peace and friendship. We could have continued that. The decisions that were made that resulted in the violence were just unfortunate, and I personally wish humans didn't behave that way.
And the important thing with the shadow is to understand that we're all in an evolutionary upward spiral, that we're moving into our higher selves, and that it all has to do with the human race. No race has no shadow. Every race has been doing horrific things to each other, and every race has an enlightened aspect. And the important thing is to move into our higher, more enlightened aspect together.
And as historians, as we go exploring these things that happened hundreds of years ago, how do we balance oral history with the written records that we have? All we have, we Europeans have this thing called writing. We, for centuries, have written things down. We've reported things. There were eyewitnesses to events that wrote them down. They may not have got it right. They may not have understood what they were seeing. They may have had an agenda. They may have distorted whatever the truth is of what was happening, but in a certain sense, it's all we have. And yet we go and talk to our native friends, and they tell us something, and we say, how do you know that? They said, my grandmother told me. My grandmother would not lie to me. But how do you address that? How can that grandmother be telling what happened 400 years ago, and it's been handed down and handed down and handed down? And the stories we hear are so insanely different, the kinds of things we've been hearing. So, what do? If we're going to resolve this, we need a new perspective. We need a new conversation. We need somehow to come together. Connie and I are looking for a way, or multiple ways, for Native people and whites to come together in council, in dialogue, in conversation, and just listen to each other. In the absence of shame, blame, guilt, anger, what do we do? Can we get together? Can we sit down? Can we talk? What do we do when we have a family blowout? We go and spend a lot of money on a therapist, or, ultimately we sit down and we see what we can do to work it out. It's going to take a whole lot of understanding, a whole lot of compassion for ourselves to let go of our own guilt for others. We've got to listen to one another. We've got to truly listen without contradicting, without trying to correct people. You're sitting across the table from someone, they tell you something that sounds outrageous. The stuff I say is outrageous to someone whose grandmother told them something different. But just to have an agreement where we can say, okay, we're going to simply not challenge, we're going to listen. I want to know what you believe, and I'd like you to listen to me. And in doing so, to honor the Pilgrim and the Indian. Just it's not restoring the balance, because it never was balanced. Maybe it was at the very, very beginning. So, we're talking about the founding of this country. We're talking about the beginning of this phenomenon called the United States. And a term we've developed for it, it's an intercultural synthesis in 3 acts. The first act was 1621 to 1675. English people came to New England, met the Indians, and changed.
I think we're running out of time, so
I know. So
move right through it.
150, 170 years later, the United States was formed. The second great synthesis happened with the Constitutional Convention in 1787. The Iroquois brought in a major contribution. Does everybody know that? That the U.S. Constitution was partly based on the Federation of the Iroquois, of the 5 nations, the 6 nations in upstate New York and Canada, who had lived together in a federation that worked and works to this day and has worked for 1,000 years.
According to the great law of the Iroquois that was brought to them by a Jesus-type figure, the great Daganoweda, the great peacemaker, brought a higher way of knowing and brought the warring tribes of the Iroquois together. And I think you're having a workshop or something to study that. Mm-hmm. So that's an important aspect of this intercultural synthesis that we call America.
And we're wrapping it up, folks, and this is the final statement we're going to make. We are at the beginning of a third great synthesis. It's up to us to bring it into being. We can do something extraordinary that will actually help to heal this country. And here's the symbol.
Hold on. One thing, we're meeting on Tuesday with the Mashpee Wampanoag Executive Director of the Massachusetts Commission on Indian Affairs. I've been building a relationship with these people in Massachusetts and Plymouth for 15 years, and finally we have a meeting on Tuesday, because with 2020 coming up and with what we call the evolutionary upward spiral, we don't have to stay stuck in old stories. We can move forward. We can expect something new to be born. And that's what the work that we do is to bring new perspectives, new information to go forward into a higher way of thinking and moving humanity up another notch.
So here you go. This is a picture of what we envision. Simply a recognition that we're one, that we're actually members of the same species, we're all human, and this beautiful graphic of a man who is a perfect balance of Pilgrim and Indian by the year 2020. That's what we're talking about. So it's challenging, and that's our work. This is what we're doing.
So, the great American dream: liberty, justice, and abundance for all, consent of the governed, self-determination, separation of church and state, equal and just laws serving the common good. Does that sound a little like the Mayflower Compact?
And briefly, just the projects that we're currently doing. This one that we're presenting to you right now developed out of this one called The First 50 Years, Freedom and Friendship at Plymouth Plantation. A great inspiration is Connie's great-great-grandfather, James Finney Baxter.
He saw what was going to happen with the denigration of the Pilgrims, and when he died, because in 1920, at the 300th anniversary, and before that, he saw this happening, and he was president of the New England Historic Genealogical Society for 20 years, and in his will, he left money to the city of Boston to build a New England pantheon to honor the early settlers of New England whose principles and ideals were the seeds of free government. He, too, was a big picture thinker.
That's one of the projects, and we're working on that with the Boston Public Library as we speak, and there's very interesting stuff. Finally, it's taken a long time, and finally we feel like we're getting a little traction. We're calling for a council dialogue. You remember I said if we could only get together and sit down and actually discuss, firstly, people's beliefs, and secondly, how we feel we can move forward. We're putting out a call to action, unity in 2020. Let's not have this, can we get over it? Look at the world. The world is rather scary right now if you watch the news. And, the only solution is unity. I'm writing a book. It's called The Mayflower Revelations, so keep an eye for that. I expect to have it completed within about a year. It's also a major motion picture in the screenplay form that we will be looking for support and actors and financing and whatever it's going to take to make this film. The book will be done next year. This film is way more I know that I can sit down at Starbucks with my laptop and get the book done and self-publish it and get the book out. Nothing's going to stop me doing that. To make the film is more challenging. And here's the story. I just want to read it to you quickly. The 93-year-old patriarch of a wealthy New England dynasty is dying. The estranged family gathers at his Barbados villa for their last Thanksgiving together. Desperate for the truth about her family's history, his granddaughter gets unexpected help from the ghost of a 17th century American Indian slave and the long-lost diary of a famous Mayflower ancestor, whose initials are PM. What she discovers changes the family and American history forever. So this is a fiction story set in the year 2020 that simply brings the truth or the primary source material back to the surface in the midst of this dysfunctional family drama that resolves the issues within this family. And
we just came from Barbados where we were doing research.
And did you notice 17th century American Indian slaves? I didn't know there were American Indian slaves. It was a huge industry in this country, especially down in the Carolinas. And Barbados was where New England Indians were sent at the end of King Philip's War. So this story is about the discovery of a diary, a fictitious diary, but that was taken by a New England woman who was a friend of the person who wrote it to the West Indies in
A New England Native American.
Yeah. And her spirit, as the old man is dying, he starts to see through the veil as people do and begins to communicate with people on the other side, and it's this message. So I'm having so much fun with that, and I have had so much fun with this. I want to thank you.
Yes, thank you.